And that right is, you'll call it nebulous, unclear under international law. But if they have that right, then as B follows from A, if they have the right to use armed force to evict their occupiers, then they have the right to receive weapons to use armed force to evict their occupiers. Now, some of you here, and I can understand it, feel uncomfortable with that sort of language. Why are we talking about armed force? Aren't we here to try to achieve peace, hopefully non-violently? And that's fair enough. But even if you are of that state of mind, it's still the case that what Israel's critics were saying was completely hypocritical. Because even Israel's critics were saying Israel has the right to prevent weapons from entering Gaza. But they didn't say the second half. And the second half is what Amnesty International clearly said. Amnesty International, in its report, Fueling Conflict, which it issued after the attack on Gaza, Amnesty said that Hamas and Israel are consistent violators of human rights. And therefore, under international law, there has to be a comprehensive total arms embargo on Hamas and Israel. And the international community, even as I said, Israel's harshest critics, hypocritically, and in my opinion in quite cowardly fashion, refused to say the second part. If you're going to bar weapons from entering Gaza, then you're also under an obligation, as Amnesty said, that's international law. The international law is, it's illegal to transfer weapons to a consistent violator of human rights. So if you're going to bar weapons from going to Gaza, then you have an obligation to also prevent weapons from going to Israel. On May 31st, as everybody in this room knows, a flotilla of boats en route to Gaza came under attack by Israel. We'll probably never know the exact sequence of events of what happened on that boat, but we have a pretty good picture now. The UN Human Rights Council dispatched a panel of international experts who quite conscientiously investigated what happened. And they produced a very large report. Whatever one might think about the Human Rights Council, and there are reasons to be skeptical about it, it cannot be said that the panel of experts was in any way tainted. They were a very impressive group of international jurists. The basic picture they presented, I'm not going to go into the detail now, but the basic picture they presented was that the Israeli assault on the Mavi Marmara, the flagship of the flotilla, the Israeli assault began when the Zodiacs, the boats, approached the Mavi Marmara, and they fired tear gas, stun grenades, and maybe, but not definitely, plastic bullets. After they were repelled, about 5 minutes later, the Israeli helicopters came in, and according to this distinguished panel of international jurists, they said that the Israeli helicopters were firing live ammunition before any Israeli commando rappelled down onto the Mavi Marmara. By the end of the assault, 9 passengers were killed, 50 wounded. Of those 9 passengers killed, the panel found of the 9, 6 were victims of, to quote them, summary executions, which is to say, in layperson's language, they were murdered in cold blood. In any event, the exact sequence of events of what happened on the boat really is, in my opinion, of only secondary importance. The fundamental facts we know. Number one, there was an illegal blockade of Gaza. Number two, there was a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And number three, Israel never expressed any interest in searching the boats for weapons. It was offered to them as an option, but they showed no interest whatsoever in searching the boats. And so under international law, if the blockade was illegal, as it was, then Israel had no right to enforce an illegal blockade. That's a basic principle of international law. The principle goes like this. You can't get a right from a wrong. If you're doing something wrong in the first place, that is to say, enforcing an illegal blockade, then you can't have the right to use force to enforce something that's illegal. And at that point, Israel has no defense. But there is still a question, or several questions. Number one, why did Israel use force against the Wadi Marmara? Let's, for argument's sake, agree, for argument's sake, that Israel had the right to block the boats from going to Gaza. For argument's sake, well, Israel had many options on how to block the boats. It could have disabled the propeller on the Wadi Marmara. It could have disabled the rudder or the engine, and then just towed the boat to an Israeli port. Israel has a formidable navy. It could have blocked physically the boats from going to Gaza. Even on Israel's own terms, what Israel did made no sense. All of you will remember Israel kept saying, the day after the attack, they kept saying, we didn't expect violent resistance. We didn't expect that they would use force. We thought they would be nonviolent. How many people remember Israel saying that the day after the attack? So raise your hand. Well, then an obvious question comes to mind. If Israel didn't expect force to be used against it, then why didn't it just board the boats in broad daylight? Why didn't it bring reporters to show the world that it was not intending to use violence? If Israel didn't intend for there to be a violent outcome, why did it use a commando unit which was trained to kill? Why didn't it use a police unit which is accustomed to handling civil resistance? The reasonable inference is that Israel wanted a bloody confrontation, although almost certainly not on the scale that ensued when the Israeli commandos panicked at the passengers' determined resistance, and then Israeli commandos decided to exact even more bloody revenge. There's also the question, well, why did it want to use force? And I think one reason is because Israel felt at that point it had no options. to stop the civil disobedience. Some of you will be aware that actually the last flotilla on May 31st was the 9th or 10th attempt by boats to enter Gaza. The first 5 boats Israel let pass through because it figured, let them have their little fun, they'll have their publicity, but then the media will get bored with it. If the media gets bored, they will gradually lose interest and give up. So the first 5 boats they let pass through. But the people organizing the flotilla, they're like Grace, they're like Tom, they're like CJPME. They don't accept defeat. They're not going to be deterred. So a 6th boat was sent and a 7th boat was sent. Now Israel realizes it has to transmit the message that this has got to stop. So they rammed the 7th boat, intercepted another boat, hoping this would deter these determined young people. But it didn't. Now the flotillas are getting bigger and bigger. Now it's 6 boats. The Mavi Marmara itself has 700 people on it. It's getting out of hand. And so Israel decided it had to use lethal force to finally transmit the message, this has got to stop. Which is exactly what Israel does and continues to do, or has done and continues to do in the West Bank. The first demonstrations against the wall that Israel has been building, they were nonviolent, and Israel basically let them pass, figuring the villagers in the West Bank would gradually despair and the thing would just disappear. But the villagers were determined. And then the demonstrations in places like Billy, they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And at that point, Israel started to use lethal force to kill several of the demonstrators, hoping this would put an end to the demonstrations. So, as one Israeli columnist put it, he said what happened on the Mavi Marmara, the Turkish ship, he said it's very similar to what Israel has been doing every week for the past 4 years in the West Bank village of Bil'im, injuring and killing unarmed civilian protesters who are demanding their basic rights. That's where the story basically ends, except for what it bodes for the future. And unfortunately, as I've already said at the beginning, regrettably, I think it bodes something quite ominous. I would actually use the word terrible for where things are now heading. Because Israel, as I said at the outset, it suffered major military defeats and embarrassments. The embarrassment climaxed with the Mavi Marmara. The Israelis were appalled by what happened on the boat, not because of the passengers who were killed, but because of the performance of their own commandos. The Israelis said it was a disgraceful fiasco, a national humiliation. Our deterrence took a bad blow. The naval commandos, they are Israel's elite fighting force. They're the equivalent of the American naval SEALs. Well, what happened? There were about 30 of these naval commandos, Israel's elite force. They repelled, I never knew that word, but now it's become part of the vocabulary. They came down on the boat, and they faced an equal number, about 30, civilian passengers